The mountain night was restless. Inside the forward operating base, the air was thick with snow, diesel, and the faint metallic bite of gun oil. The base wasn't much, just a scattering of concrete bunkers, a few sandbag walls, and a runway barely long enough for supply aircraft to land. But tonight, it had become a refuge for a Navy SEAL team that was bleeding, exhausted, and dangerously close to being overrun. The men had returned from a mission that hadn't gone according to plan. What was supposed to be a clean extraction turned into a nightmare. They had fought through ambushes, improvised explosives, and relentless enemy pursuit. By the time they staggered back through the gates of the base, they were down to their last magazines. Some carrying wounded, others too tired to even speak. Their eyes said everything. This fight wasn't over. The enemy was regrouping, and it was only a matter of time before they came crashing down on the base. Inside a dimly lit command room, the SEAL captain stood hunched over a table covered in maps and radio equipment. His face was hard, worn with years of combat, but the lines around his eyes revealed more than age. They showed the weight of command, the burden of having men's lives tied to his decisions. Around him, his operators shifted uneasily, checking weapons, exchanging whispers, trying to mask their fatigue. The captain knew what they all knew. They weren't going to hold out long without air support. On the ground, SEALs could fight, maneuver, and improvise. But when the numbers turned against them, when the enemy had vehicles, mortars, and waves of fighters, they needed the sky on their side. He straightened, his voice breaking the heavy silence. Any combat pilots here? It wasn't a question he expected to yield much. This was a SEAL forward operating post, not an air wing base. His men were trained for water insertions, demolitions, raids, not flying aircraft. But desperation forced him to ask anyway. The room shifted with restless movement. Operators looked at one another, shaking their heads, some lowering their eyes. Nobody spoke. The silence was answer enough. Then, from the far end of the room, there was the sound of a chair scraping lightly against the concrete floor. Heads turned, and eyes fell on someone few of the SEALs had paid much attention to during their time here. She was young, mid-30s maybe, but carried herself with a stillness that drew notice once the spotlight turned to her. She wasn't dressed like them, not in combat kit, weighed down with gear, but in standard fatigues, smudged with grease from long hours working on base equipment. Her sleeves were rolled, her hair pulled back tight. A navy patch clung to her shoulder, faded but unmistakable. Slowly, she rose to her feet. "I can fly," she said. The words were calm, unshaken, yet they hit the room with more force than a gunshot. Several of the SEALs frowned, exchanging doubtful glances. It wasn't hostility. They had seen enough action to know better than to judge too quickly, but skepticism was instinct. In their world, trust wasn't given lightly, and a statement like hers demanded proof. The captain's gaze fixed on her. He said nothing at first, just studied her expression. The way her eyes didn't flicker, the way she stood straight despite the weight of every stare in the room. She didn't waver. "What do you fly?" he finally asked, his voice low, testing. F/A-18 Super Hornet, she replied without hesitation. The reaction was immediate. Some of the SEALs muttered under their breath. Others looked at her with something approaching surprise. The Super Hornet was no ordinary aircraft. It was a twin-engine multi-role fighter, fast, deadly, and sophisticated. Every soldier who had ever fought on the ground knew its reputation. When the Hornet was overhead, you had a guardian angel with teeth. The captain's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. He wasn't one for showing emotion, but the faint narrowing of his eyes suggested that for the first time in hours, he saw a sliver of possibility. "You're telling me you can get one of those in the air? Here," he pressed. She nodded once. "There's one on the strip, grounded for maintenance, but flyable. I can bring it up." The room went quiet again, but this time the silence wasn't disbelief. It was calculation. The SEALs glanced at their captain, waiting for him to weigh the risk. If she was telling the truth, she might be the only chance they had. If she was wrong or unprepared, then sending her up meant losing time and lives they couldn't afford. One of the younger SEALs leaned against the wall, muttering, "She's not even in flight gear. What's she gonna do? Duct tape that bird together and hope." But his voice carried less bite than he intended. Doubt was normal. Hope was dangerous. The captain raised a hand to silence the murmurs. His gaze never left the pilot. "You realize what you're saying?" he said, his tone somewhere between a challenge and a warning. "If you're wrong, if you're not what you claim, men die tonight." She didn't flinch. "I know what's at stake." Her voice carried no arrogance, no defensiveness, just certainty. Something shifted in the air then. The men in the room might not have known her, but they recognized that tone. It was the same one their captain used when he gave an order no one dared question. The same tone seasoned operators carried when they volunteered for impossible missions. It was the voice of someone who understood consequences and accepted them. For the first time, a flicker of respect passed between them. The captain exhaled long and slow and gave a curt nod. "Show me." The room broke into movement at once. Radios crackled, boots scraped against concrete, and men rushed to prepare for whatever came next. The SEALs weren't a unit that dealt in hesitation. Once a decision was made, they moved. Still, the energy was different now. Beneath the skepticism, beneath the fatigue, something else stirred. The possibility of survival. She followed the captain out into the mountain air, the frigid wind pulling at her sleeves. The runway lay ahead, faintly lit under scattered lamps, a dark silhouette of an aircraft hulking at its edge. The F/A-18 Super Hornet waited like a beast in slumber, its gray paint chipped, its frame weathered, but its presence undeniable. For a moment, the pilot slowed her steps, letting her hand brush across the rough metal of a nearby Humvee. It had been years since she'd flown in combat, years since she'd heard the thunder of twin turbofans beneath her, but the memory was etched into her bones. She didn't rise because she wanted recognition. She rose because she couldn't sit still while men fought without the cover they needed. Behind her, the SEAL captain watched her with unreadable eyes. He had seen countless warriors, bold ones, reckless ones, skilled ones. But rarely did someone rise in silence, carry confidence like armor, and make others believe without raising their voice. She hadn't fired a shot. She hadn't touched the controls yet. But already the course of the night was shifting, and all it had taken was 4 words spoken in a quiet, unwavering tone. "I can fly." The mountain hummed with unease. Somewhere in the distance, the echo of sporadic gunfire rolled across the peaks. The forward operating base was small and vulnerable, a lonely outpost surrounded by hostile ground. Inside, the SEAL captain's words still hung heavy in the air, and she had risen. Now every pair of eyes in the dim command room was on her. She wasn't wearing flight gear or a bomber jacket, nothing to declare her as anything more than another body station at the base. A smudge of hydraulic fluid streaked her forearm, and her boots were scuffed from maintenance duty. Yet despite her ordinary appearance, she stood straighter than the rest, her eyes steady, her voice calm. The silence that followed was sharper than any blade. Some SEALs scoffed under their breath. Others narrowed their eyes, trying to place her. They had seen her around the base, but hadn't given her much thought. She kept to herself, busy with equipment, communications checks, and repairs. She wasn't part of their missions. She wasn't someone they trained with, sweated with, or bled alongside. And yet, here she was, claiming she could do the one thing none of them could, the one thing that might keep them alive. One SEAL, broad-shouldered with snow still streaking his face, leaned forward. "Ma'am," he said, his tone carrying equal parts disbelief and sarcasm. "No offense, but you look like you should be fixing radios, not flying a Super Hornet." The room gave a low chuckle, but it was forced, uneasy. She didn't flinch. Her gaze moved from the skeptical operator back to the captain. "I don't look like anything. I'm a combat pilot. You asked if there was one in the room. There is." Her words cut through the laughter like steel. The SEAL who had spoken sat back, lips pressed into a tight line. He hadn't expected her to answer so firmly. The captain's eyes stayed on her, steady, weighing. He wasn't the kind of man to let bravado sway him. He wanted proof. His next question came in a low, even tone. Her answer came without hesitation, as though it had been waiting for years. F/A-18 Super Hornet. The effect was immediate. Even the doubters fell quiet. Everyone in the room knew the name. The Super Hornet wasn't glamorous. It wasn't the newest, sleekest fighter in the inventory, but it was something far more important. It was reliable. It was built for the grunts on the ground, for men like them. It was the aircraft that could fly missions in any weather, take hits, and keep fighting. Its twin engines were legendary. Power plants so robust they could keep flying on one engine if needed. The SEALs shifted uncomfortably, their skepticism colliding with the possibility that this woman might actually be what she claimed. The captain studied her, his voice dropping lower. "You're telling me you can get that bird up from the strip right now?" She gave a single sharp nod. "Yes, it hasn't flown in days due to weather, but it's airworthy. I know her systems. I can bring her alive." For a moment, no one moved. The sound of a humming generator outside filled the silence, along with the distant crack of small arms fire somewhere beyond the perimeter. The captain finally stepped closer, his boots scraping the concrete floor. He was a man who'd built his life on assessing risk, on measuring men and women in seconds, knowing who could deliver and who would crack. He locked eyes with her. "You know what happens if you're wrong," he said. "If you can't fly, if you're lying, if you fold under pressure, my men die tonight. Do you understand that?" Her face didn't change. "I understand." The quiet assurance in her voice unsettled the room. There was no arrogance, no defensiveness, just truth. She wasn't making a promise she couldn't keep. She was stating a fact she had lived. The SEALs shifted again, this time differently. Doubt was still there, but something else crept in, a reluctant respect. They had seen countless men boast, brag, and fail under fire. But rarely did someone stand this calm, this steady in the face of challenge. One of the younger operators whispered to another, "If she's really a Hornet pilot, hell, we might actually have a chance." The captain's jaw flexed. He turned, pacing a short line, then stopped abruptly and faced her again. "All right," he said. "Prove it." The room came alive at once. Radios sparked. Men shifted, orders were barked. A few SEALs grabbed their rifles and moved toward the exit, preparing to escort her to the runway. The weight of the decision hung heavy, but once the captain gave the word, hesitation had no place. She stepped forward, passing through the circle of hardened operators, who still studied her, as though trying to reconcile her ordinary appearance with the extraordinary claim she'd made. Some gave small nods as she passed. Others kept their eyes narrowed, but none spoke. As she neared the door, one SEAL muttered under his breath, just loud enough for the men nearby to hear, "Guess we'll see if she's all talk." Another SEAL, older, scarred from years of deployments, shook his head. "Doesn't matter what she looks like. That Hornet gets airborne. We'll be the ones thanking her." They filed out into the mountain night. The base was quiet except for the restless hum of generators and the distant chatter of gunfire. The stars above stretched wide and cold. On the far edge of the runway, faintly illuminated by floodlights, the hulking silhouette of the F/A-18 sat in silence. Its paint was faded, its edges worn, but its presence was unmistakable. The beast was waiting. As they walked, the captain kept his eyes on her, still studying every movement. She walked with purpose, neither too fast nor too slow, her posture as steady as her voice had been inside the command room. The SEALs followed in silence, their weapons slung but ready, their eyes scanning the mountain ridges beyond the perimeter. The enemy could strike at any time, and they all knew the seconds ticking away were precious. But for the first time since they had retreated to the base, there was a flicker of something in the air that hadn't been there before. And it had started the moment she quietly rose to her feet. The mountain wind pressed against the base walls, carrying with it the faint sounds of conflict beyond the perimeter. Every man inside knew the enemy was repositioning, gathering strength for the next strike. Tom was not on their side. Yet inside the command room, the tension wasn't just about the enemy outside. It was about the woman who had dared to stand and claimed she could turn the tide. The SEALs had seen their share of specialists before: techs, engineers, medics, pilots who visited bases briefly before vanishing back into safer roles. Some earned respect quickly. Others faded into the background, but none had ever declared themselves in a moment like this. She stood by the door now, ready to walk out toward the dark runway, but the room wasn't finished with her. The weight of the team's doubt pressed down hard. "Captain," one of the senior chiefs finally spoke, his voice gravelly and sharp. "We don't even know her name. For all we know, she's been changing batteries and radios since she got here. You're ready to bet our lives on that." The captain didn't respond immediately. His eyes stayed locked on her, calm but piercing. He wasn't a man swayed by emotions. He trusted instincts honed through years of combat. Still, he knew his men had a right to their doubts. Trust had to be earned. She didn't wait for the captain to defend her. Instead, she took a step forward, her voice clear. "Captain, I flew 2 tours in the Pacific Theater. Over 80 close air support missions. I've flown in and out of whether no one else would enter. I know what it's like to be on the ground waiting, praying for air cover. I've been the voice that answered those calls." The room quieted. She turned her gaze across the SEALs, her tone sharper now, cutting through their skepticism. "You think I'm just a maintenance tech. But right now, none of you can get that Hornet off the ground. You don't have to like me. You don't even have to believe me. You just have to decide whether you'd rather keep waiting for a rescue that might not come or take the chance standing right in front of you." The words hung in the air like smoke after a gunshot. Some of the younger operators shifted uncomfortably, their bravado cracking under the weight of her conviction. The senior chief narrowed his eyes, not ready to yield. "Talk's cheap. We've all heard guys brag about what they've done. Some of them don't come back when it's time to prove it." The captain raised a hand, silencing further words. He walked toward her slowly, boots echoing against the floor, stopping just a few feet away. His eyes searched hers, looking for hesitation, for fear, for anything that might betray her claim. But all he saw was certainty. "What's your call sign?" he asked quietly. Her lips pressed into a faint line. "Lightning." It wasn't said with flair, just matter of fact, but the name carried weight. Call signs weren't chosen. They were earned, given by squadrons to define a pilot's reputation. The captain had heard hundreds of them over the years. Some were forgettable, but Lightning was not a name given lightly. A murmur spread through the room. The SEALs exchanged glances. This was no ordinary pilot. The captain finally nodded once, as if something in him had been confirmed. "That Hornet's yours then." The decision seemed final, but not everyone was ready to accept it. "Sir," the senior chief pressed again, lowering his voice, but keeping the edge. "You're really going to let her take that plane up? She hasn't even suited up. We've never flown with her. If she screws this up, it's not just her, it's all of us." The captain turned sharply, his voice like a hammer on steel. "Chief, if you've got a better pilot hidden somewhere in your rucksack, speak now. Otherwise, stand down." The chief clenched his jaw, then said nothing. The room settled into a heavy silence. The captain's word was final, but the doubt hadn't disappeared. It clung to the air like static, thick and unshakable. She felt it pressing against her from all sides. The unspoken questions, the mistrust, the quiet calculations of men who had survived countless battles by trusting only their own. She didn't resent it. In fact, she understood it. Trust wasn't given here. It was forged in fire. But she wasn't here to win their approval. She was here to do a job. "Get me to the runway," she said firmly. 2 SEALs moved instinctively to flank her, rifles slung but ready. The captain gestured for the rest to prepare. Radios sparked as messages went out, relaying the decision across the base. Mechanics stirred. Floodlights flickered to life along the strip, and shadows danced across the hulking frame of the waiting F/A-18. Still, the doubt lingered as they walked through the corridors toward the open air. Fragments of whispered conversation followed behind. "She better be who she says she is. If she is, we might just have a shot, or she gets herself killed before we're out the gate." She heard it all, but didn't react. Doubt wasn't new to her. She'd felt it the first time she walked onto a flight line. The only woman in a squadron of hardened combat pilots. She'd felt it the first time she strapped into a Hornet and had to prove to her crew chief she wasn't going to crack under pressure. Doubt was as much a part of combat as bullets or explosions. But doubt never killed her. Fear never broke her, and tonight neither would. When they stepped out into the mountain night, the sight of the F/18 waiting in silence stirred something deep inside her. The Super Hornet was battered, scarred from years of service, but to her it was beautiful. Its twin vertical stabilizers stretched out like a predator at rest, its nose heavy with the unmistakable profile of a true multi-role fighter. The sight alone was enough to silence even the loudest skeptic. The SEAL captain stood beside her now, his voice low, meant only for her. "You've got one shot at this. Make it count." She met his gaze steady as ever. "I don't miss." Behind them, the men who doubted her now stood watching, some with arms crossed, others shifting uneasily. The doubt hadn't vanished, but it had transformed. It was no longer disbelief. It was anticipation. They wanted to see if she would prove them wrong. The twin turbofans of the F/18 loomed silent, waiting. And so did the room, full of warriors whose lives now hung in the balance between doubt and trust. The runway stretched out like a scar across the mountain night. Faint floodlights lined its cracked edges, casting pale cones of light that barely reached the snow beyond. In the distance, the peaks loomed black and jagged, a reminder of the hostile terrain closing in on them. Somewhere out there, enemy fighters were regrouping, preparing to press their advantage. The SEALs knew they were racing against time, but for this moment all eyes were fixed on the hulking shadow at the far end of the strip. The F/18 Super Hornet sat under a thin veil of camouflage netting, its body weathered, its paint chipped by snow and wind. Its engines were quiet, its cockpit dark, as if the beast were sleeping. To most, it looked like little more than an aging relic of another war. But to her, it was something else entirely. It was home. As she walked toward it, the crunch of gravel under her boots sounded louder than the wind. Two SEALs flanked her silently, scanning the mountain ridges beyond the perimeter for threats. The captain followed several paces back, his eyes never leaving her. His men had doubts, but his mind was made up. If this woman could breathe life into that war machine, she would be the only thing standing between his team and annihilation. The mechanics on base had done little more than keep the Hornet in mothballs. Its maintenance was patchwork, its systems neglected. Most assumed it would never see combat again. But as she approached, she could already see the signs. The bird wasn't dead. It was waiting. She paused at the nose, her hand brushing lightly against the radome protruding from the front. The APG-73 radar system. She remembered the first time she'd used it in combat. The precise targeting, the clean lock-ins, the devastating accuracy that came from marrying pilot skill with advanced technology. Ground troops had cheered then, their lives saved by the precision she unleashed from above. The memory carried her now. One of the younger SEALs, posted nearby, with a rifle, raised a skeptical brow. "That thing doesn't look like it's flown in months." She didn't bother to answer. She crouched low, pulling herself up the side ladder with practiced ease, her movements fluid and sure, as though she had done this 1,000 times. In truth, she had. Muscle memory carried her, each motion deliberate and confident. Inside the cockpit, the air was stale, thick with the scent of hydraulic fluid and dust. She settled into the seat, running her hands across the controls. To anyone else, it might have looked like an old, forgotten cockpit, a relic. To her, it was alive. Her fingertips danced across switches, levers, and dials like a pianist reacquainting herself with a long-lost instrument. Below, the SEALs gathered, their shadows cast long across the tarmac. They watched her silhouette moving inside the canopy. Some crossed their arms, some shook their heads, others leaned forward, curious. The tension was palpable. This was the moment of truth. The captain stepped closer to the nose of the plane, his voice calm, but commanding. "How long?" She didn't look down. 5 minutes, maybe less. 5 minutes we don't have, he muttered under his breath. But he didn't stop her. Inside the cockpit, she flipped the battery switch. The panel before her flickered, dim lights struggling to come alive. She frowned slightly, then tapped the gauge with her knuckle. The system hummed reluctantly, like a giant awakening from sleep. She moved quickly, testing hydraulics, power, and fuel levels. The F/A-18 groaned, but responded. "Come on, girl," she whispered softly. "Wake up." One by one, the systems lit. The HUD flickered green. The radios crackled faint static. She reached for the throttles, setting the first engine to spool. Outside, the seals stiffened as the right turbofan coughed violently, spitting snow and exhaust into the air. It whined, faltered, then caught, the turbines spinning into a steady roar. A few seals exchanged glances, surprise breaking through their skepticism. The second engine followed, coughing less this time, its roar blending with the first. The mountain air trembled with power. Inside the cockpit, she checked her displays, her eyes moving with speed and precision. Everything was functional enough. Not perfect, but in combat, nothing ever was. On the ground, the captain folded his arms, his face unreadable, but his eyes betrayed the faintest shift. He was watching a professional at work, someone who didn't need to prove herself with words. She was proving herself with action. The canopy lowered with a hiss, sealing her inside. The base lights reflected faintly off the glass, her face barely visible, but steady as stone. She slid the headset on, flicking to the frequency the seals used. "Control, this is Lightning. Systems green. Engines hot. Preparing for taxi." The seal nearest the captain nearly dropped his radio, staring up at the bird. He muttered almost to himself. She wasn't lying. The captain allowed the ghost of a smirk to touch his lips. No, she wasn't. The Super Hornet rumbled forward, its wheels grinding against the cracked runway. The sound reverberated across the base, drawing soldiers and staff from the shadows to watch. They gathered at the edges of the strip, their disbelief slowly shifting into awe. For months, this aircraft had sat forgotten, a relic left to gather snow in the mountains. Now, under the hands of one determined pilot, it was alive again. Inside the cockpit, her breathing steadied, her hands firm on the controls. She felt the vibration beneath her, the raw, familiar rhythm of the Hornet. It was more than a machine. It was a part of her, an extension of everything she had trained for, everything she had survived. She thought of the men waiting on the ground, the SEALs whose eyes bore into her with doubt only minutes earlier. She thought of the captain, his silent challenge, his demand for proof. And she thought of the enemy waiting just beyond the ridges, confident they had trapped America's most elite warriors. Not tonight. Her voice came cool and steady over the radio, cutting through the roar of twin turbofans. "Lightning to ground. Let's go hunting." The SEALs on the tarmac stood frozen for a moment, the reality sinking in. The captain finally spoke, his voice low, but carrying across the group. "Mount up. She's in the fight." As the F/A-18 taxied down the strip, snow and exhaust rising in its wake, the doubt that had filled the room hours earlier began to fade. In its place grew something stronger, something the SEALs hadn't allowed themselves to feel since the mission had gone wrong. The Hornet was alive, and so was their chance. The mountain air quaked with the low, guttural growl of twin engines as the F/A-18 Super Hornet taxied toward the edge of the runway. Snow and heated exhaust plumed around its landing gear, the mountain's dry breath mixing with jet wash. To the SEALs standing watch on the tarmac, the sight was surreal. This advanced machine brought back to life by a pilot no one had expected. Now it thundered forward with purpose. Inside the cockpit, she tightened her grip on the stick. Her gloved fingers moved with a rhythm ingrained by years of training. The Hornet was old, stubborn, but obedient in her hands. Every dial, every flickering display, spoke to her like an old friend rediscovered. Her voice came cool over the comms. "Lightning to ground, rolling in 5." The SEAL captain raised his radio, answering with the steadiness of a man who had seen countless battles, but understood the gravity of this one. "Lightning, this is Hammer 1. Godspeed." The nose of the Hornet pointed toward the dark horizon. Ahead, the runway stretched like a narrow bridge into uncertainty. Beyond those ridges, the enemy massed hundreds of fighters who thought they had the SEALs cornered. She eased the throttles forward. The engines roared, spitting streams of fire into the night. The beast trembled, then surged ahead, landing gears screeching against cracked asphalt. At 140 knots, the nose began to lift. At 160, the landing gear screamed their farewell and left the ground. The Hornet, heavy and twine-engined, climbed into the mountain night with a defiance that seemed almost alive. The SEALs on the ground tilted their heads skyward. Some cheered under their breath. Others clenched fists in relief. For the first time in hours, hope wasn't a fragile thing. It had shape, wings, and teeth. On the other side of the ridges, meanwhile, the SEAL team pinned in the valley fought tooth and nail. Their position had eroded hour by hour. Ammunition was running dangerously low. Enemy mortar rounds pounded the slopes. Snow and fire erupting around them with bone-rattling force. Lieutenant Martinez, the ground team's second in command, crawled behind a battered rock wall, radio pressed to his ear. Static hiss mixed with fragments of comms he could barely piece together. He shouted over the gunfire, "Hammer Base, this is Hammer 2. We are at breaking point. If her doesn't come through in minutes, we're done out here." The answer came through steady and cool. A woman's voice. "Copy that, Hammer 2. Lightning inbound. ETA, 3 minutes." Martinez blinked, his snow-streaked face etched with disbelief. He hadn't expected anyone to make it airborne, let alone this fast. He looked at his men, exhausted, bloodied but still firing. A spark of something long absent flared in his chest. "She's coming," he muttered. "Hold the line. She's coming." In the skies, the Hornet leveled off at a low altitude, hugging the terrain. Her eyes flicked between the terrain display and the ridges looming ahead. She knew every bump and shift of the machine, trusted it like she trusted her own heartbeat. Her HUD lit with green symbology. Targets painted on her screen. Multiple heat signatures clustered around the valley. She could almost feel the desperation radiating from the embattled SEALs below. She armed the weapon systems. The switches clicked into readiness. The beast arming itself for war. The APG-73 radar hummed with an almost ominous vibration beneath her feet. Her voice cut through the comms, clear and resolute. "Lightning on station. Hammer 2, mark your position with smoke." Below, a SEAL popped a red smoke grenade, its plume trailing upward through the darkness like a flare of blood. She spotted it instantly, her eyes narrowing. Visual confirmed. Stand by for fire. The first run, the Hornet dipped low, wings level, engine screaming. She aligned her crosshairs on a cluster of vehicles surrounding the SEAL's perimeter. With steady hands, she squeezed the trigger. Missiles streaked from their launch rails toward enemy positions where ammunition and heavy weapons had been concentrated for the anticipated assault. The ridge line erupted in fire and fragmentation as munition stores detonated in catastrophic chain reaction that eliminated entire fighting positions. The enemy's coordinated advance immediately halted as tactical organization disintegrated under unexpected air attack from capabilities they had confirmed as destroyed. SEAL teams and conventional infantry elements positioned in defensive sectors began shouting and gesturing skyward. Their expressions mixing profound disbelief with growing realization that impossible air support had materialized when all intelligence indicated complete absence of aviation capability. Radio channels filled with excited transmissions attempting to confirm what visual observation was reporting. She executed aggressive maneuvering that brought the Super Hornet into a hard banking turn, aircraft maintaining altitude barely above treetop level, while cutting across visual horizon with precision that demonstrated mastery of multi-role combat flying developed through extensive experience. The maneuvers she performed weren't standard patterns, but aggressive tactics that maximized weapons effectiveness while minimizing exposure to ground fire. Each weapons engagement provided defending forces with additional survival time. Each precision strike literally stitched continued existence into contested terrain by eliminating threats that would have overwhelmed defensive positions within hours. Her target selection demonstrated tactical understanding that went beyond simply shooting at visible enemies. She was systematically dismantling their command structure and destroying their offensive capability. To enemy forces observing from their disruptive positions, the appearance must have seemed supernatural. Air power they had received absolute confirmation had been eliminated through previous attacks, was somehow operating with full combat effectiveness and extraordinary skill level. Their intelligence had been perfect. Their conclusions had been catastrophically wrong. To friendly personnel observing from defensive positions, the explanation was becoming increasingly clear through undeniable demonstration. Someone they had systematically overlooked and underestimated was currently executing combat aviation operations that were preserving everyone's survival through capabilities that exceeded what most qualified combat pilots could have achieved. Multiple hours later, when ammunition loads had been depleted to levels requiring return to base for rearming, she guided the Super Hornet back to the mountain facility and executed landing with control precision that eliminated any remaining doubt about her qualifications among those who had witnessed her entire flight profile from takeoff through combat operations to recovery. The landing approach demonstrated advanced skills. Smooth deceleration, precise control despite mountain winds, gentle touchdown that barely compressed the landing gear struts. It was textbook execution that would have satisfied the most demanding flight instructor, demonstrating that her capabilities extended beyond merely operating the aircraft to include the advanced skills that separated competent pilots from exceptional aviators. When the twin turbofans decelerated to complete stop following proper shutdown procedures, assembled personnel had already formed spontaneous gathering around the landing area despite the continuing security concerns that should have kept them at assigned positions.